Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Sharon Florentine. I am the Senior Managing Editor for Channel Brands here at CyberRisk Alliance. Those are Channel E2E and MSSP Alert. And I am thrilled to be here today with Liam Downward. He is the Chief Product Officer at CYRISMA. Is that correct? Did I get your title right?
You got it correct.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I'm starting off with a bang, folks. Awesome. Yeah. And today we are going to be talking about simplifying GRC for cybersecurity professionals. So before we get into the conversation with Liam, I need to go through some housekeeping items for you. First of all, please know the session is being recorded. So if you miss any or all of it, or you want to watch it again, you want to share it with a friend or a colleague, you will be able to do so in about 24 hours. It will be available for you on demand. So check back and grab that. We would love to hear your questions and comments for me and for Liam. So you can submit those at any time during the presentation. You can see the blue circles there at the bottom of your console. There is a Q&A and a chat feature. Feel free, send questions, comments, anything to us. We will bring them right into the conversation. We want to hear from you. Question early, question often, keep them coming. And yeah, so I think that's all the housekeeping stuff I have right now. So let's dive into the conversation. Liam, thank you for joining us today. We're so happy to have you. And I'm going to start off by asking you to give us a brief definition of what GRC is and why it is so important, especially today.
It's a good question because GRC or governance, risk, and compliance can become very complex, right? It can be a multitude of different things for different people. But I always simplify it and tell people the following. So look at it from a standpoint in GRC is what people say and what people do and what you have written need to be aligned. And if they're not aligned, that creates your risk, your compliance, and your governance aspect out of that to say, okay, how do we fix that? And that is why it's very important, because we all have to be in alignment with a standard. We have to be in alignment with a policy or a process that your entity or your organization is implementing. And we need to make sure that we know exactly what's going on at any given time, whether that is from a tactical standpoint or strategic, and bringing those two together, because sometimes they're always looked upon as being an IT function and the other one as being risk management function. Today it has to be a merger of both, and they have to be on the same page and singing from the same hymn sheet.
Totally makes sense. So you've mentioned risk a number of times in there, and I'm wondering when and why cyber risk has become such a critical piece of the enterprise risk. That's a mouthful.
Yes, it is.
In recent years.
And it's because we got to look at our assets, right? What's important to the organization? You got time, money, and people, right, on one side. And then you actually have your digital assets, whether it's paper or electronic, okay? Now, we have to basically understand that where the bad actors going after. They want to go after the data, but they also need to look at how do they get access to it. One, they want to take enough time to potentially compromise the system. We got to look at the resources and people, right? And then how much money are they spending on cybersecurity to basically mitigate that risk down to a tolerable level. So that is why it's becoming more prevalent, because there's so many moving pieces, right? You know, everybody says I can have the best policies in the world. I can have the best technology in the world. But the problem is always between the chair and the keyboard that lets the rest of the security down. The human is actually also a risk as well, which is why it's so big on education. And that's why I go back to what I said earlier about what people say, what people do, and what people put into practice is a very key thing when it comes to GRC.
Yeah. That makes sense. And it seems like if it's too complex or it's too difficult for that person between the keyboard, in front of the keyboard, it may not happen.
It's true. It may not happen is because it's kind of like ignorance is bliss, right? It's the ostrich effect. Put the head in the sand, or touch wood, it hasn't happened yet, right? So that's where they play that off, because they look at it and say, well, I just need to focus on the business, not in the business, because maybe depending on the size of the entity and the organization determines how much they're going to spend on security, because their goal is, where am I going to get the next revenue? Where am I going to get the next deal that's going out there, this business? And if I invest in security, it's going to hit me. Well, unfortunately, you've got vendor risk management situations happening right now when you're going for an actual proposal or for a bid. They're now requiring you to have a certain level of security because you become a risk to them, especially if you're connecting to their network and doing other various elements, engaging with them, that if you are the weakest link, you potentially become a potential path of compromise or breach for them. So it's a very big thing that business is now really tying in cybersecurity, which then means we have to have resiliency. We need to understand what's going on, and that's all goes back up to GRC. But it goes back to tactical and strategic, right? Merging those two together. They're two separate things on paper, but in reality, they merge together, because vulnerability management, knowing where your sensitive data is, all ties into system hardening. Do I have policies and procedures, data classification policies, which is all part of the GRC and strategic element around that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
So, what role do managed service providers, MSPs, and managed security service providers, MSSPs, play in helping clients align the risk management and the compliance with those business goals?
So it's funny you say, because you talk about, and I'll just take a step out of the way of the GRC for a second, right? And we have this triad called confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where most MSPs focused on the availability, which means make sure the systems are continually up all the time, that their clients can actually maintain a level of integrity when it came to the systems to be able to do stuff. But times have changed. Now it's where, okay, when you talk about cybersecurity, they're looking at you being the expert to provide everything to them, whether that's tactical element patching to vulnerability, EDR, BDR, all the different acronyms out there,
right,
and also making sure that they're compliant and providing those virtual CISO services, because, on the availability side can only go so far, and now they're encroaching into the virtual CISO service, right? Which means then in the virtual CISO, they have to provide both the tactical as well as strategic, and making sure they meet a certain standard, whether it's CIS version 8 on the controls, whether it's NIST, CSF, different types, or CMMC. We all need to make sure we're aware of that. And that's the MSSP side of things as well, which beforehand they stepped away from professional services, and now they're engaging back into professional services again to provide that differentiator, that different element of value that they can provide to their clients or potential prospects.
Yeah. Are there specific, statutes or mandates? You mentioned NIST and the CIS controls. I've done some stories recently about the new FinCEN requirements, CMMC. Are there specific compliance mandates that MSPs and MSSPs should be particularly aware of? Or all of them, or none of them?
In actuality, it's kind of like, have you ever seen the meme where there's so many like bubbles around which regulation do I work with today, right? It's that kind of thing. What I tell people to do is to say, okay, you have state level regulations, right? Mm-hmm. Like, for example, breach notification around PII. Then you start getting into the GDPR stance, which is California Consumer Protection Act, which is in essence another variant of the GDPR out of Europe. Then you start getting into regulations at a federal level, whether it's HIPAA, whether it's SOX, whether it's GLBA. And it's all these things that are kind of like all instituting, but they all kind of have a framework where they crosswalk across multiple different things. So if you say, okay, so let's say, for example, take CIS controls version 8. I can, or 8.1, which is the latest one, use that as a baseline of my framework. There's crosswalks to other regulations, which makes it easier for me to kind of plug and play of which regulation today that company needs to work with, or they're moving into something. Biggest thing that people are having, had the hard time is, like, if you look at car dealerships, they're now being treated as a financial institution now, which means they're not only just selling cars, they also need to think about all the data that they're providing, whether that's loan information, all the rest of it, as a bank would be doing. And now that's putting a little bit more pressure on the company to think differently, because it's going to affect culture. It's going to affect how they work organizationally. But that's where the MSP and the MSSP can come in and alleviate that pressure, allowing the organization to work on the business and for them to work in the business to provide that cohesiveness, to be able to say, hey, we can bring you along the compliance track and set a deadline down the road and say, here's what we're looking to comply, and these are the things that we're going to put in place for you, both tactically and strategically, to get you where you need to be, but you still continue on doing your day-to-day business. Let us worry about that.
Gotcha. And I can't remember the particular software, but there was an incident a few months ago where software that was mostly used by car dealerships to do financial transactions was actually targeted by a cyber attack. And it was, there were a lot of folks talking about the financial compliance regulations around that, and, you know, whether or not they needed to be beefed up or not to address these kind of situations. So it's definitely relevant for sure.
It's definitely relevant, but let's take actions for a multitude of different. You look at HIPAA, same thing, right? It hasn't been really updated in a number of years. It needs to be updated. But the updating comes back from feedback from the field, from the MSP, the MSSPs that need to state something to kind of say, hey, we need to either beef this up, because the more people that gets compromised and being breached because of being ignorant is bliss kind of scenario, right? Which means I'll ignore it because it hasn't happened to me yet. And if the regulation doesn't have enough teeth in it, they tend to shy away from something unless something impacts them, right? Financially, right? Biggest thing is cyber insurance now. Cyber insurance is making it harder for people to declare because they want to identify where you're negligent. And if it's something that you've been negligent of, say for example, you're an MSP and you have a customer that basically did not provide a vendor risk management in place, and one of their vendors was compromised, came across a VPN connected to you, you were hit with ransomware, you go and declare, the insurance company that finds out that you did not implement a good GRC program around vendor risk management, they're going to say you're negligent. Guess what? Your client is on the hook for that full amount of money for restoration.
Yeah.
These are things that we have to do. And that's not fear, uncertainty, doubt. That's realism, because it's now impacting your ability to hit the bottom line when it comes to revenue generation that you can't afford, not knowing what the potential costs will be.
Yeah. Great point. And it seems like so many folks get into this situation where it's like, okay, well, I could spend this money in the short term for something that may or may not happen, but then, you know, the MSP, MSSP's role is to come in and say, yes, but the financial implications, if you don't in the longer term, if something does happen, are severe.
Correct. And this is where accountability comes into it, right? GRC itself has a level of accountability, but it's really accountability when it comes to a certain type of regulation. But there also has to be accountability at a department level, if you want to call it as such. And we'll say the MSP or the MSSP are part of IT, part of risk management, that they need to state that when they identify a potential risk, right, that can easily be fixed through training, policies, or whatever GRC can actually implement. But the organization says, hey, I'll give you an example, healthcare, right? You're going into the board from a healthcare standpoint, and you state that we've discovered a potential risk, but it's going to cost you $50,000 to mitigate that risk instead of paying $300,000 if you potentially from a fine standpoint. Now, what's going to happen is they're going to turn around and say, well, how do I turn that cost center into a profit center? Now, the board may turn around and say, well, I'm going to order this $1 million Da Vinci because it can turn into 10 to 20, $30 million of revenue. Well, that point, this is where the MSP and the MSSP need to say, hey, you sign off on the risk. We brought it to your attention. That means then we're not going to be held accountable if something happens in doing that. That's also part of governance and with the risk compliance aspect, covering yourselves by identifying that risk, bringing it to the appropriate people. If they don't sign off on it, then you need to hold accountability, because now CISA and all the rest are making sure that organizations have the right to go after MSPs and MSSPs if they feel they're negligent. And in these situations, this is where you need to bring and use GRC in a way of saying, hey, we're identifying the risk. We have an opportunity to fix this from a compliance or from a risk management standpoint. Now, if you're not willing to do something about it, you sign off it and say, here's the reason why, that if it does become gets compromised or breached, you're covered. The entity then at that point is still held accountable. And this is a problem we have in the industry across the board, where we need to focus on how do we get out of being focused on availability and bringing in the confidentiality and integrity of systems, but also looking at yourself as being, hey, we need to cover ourselves now, because now we're potentially in the line of sight of compromise or breach ourselves, as well as potentially being used in a lawsuit if somebody finds that we're negligent.
Yeah, that liability piece, and being able to cover yourself if the client says, no, thank you, I don't want to sign up for that. Okay, well, now it's in the contract that I offered and you declined. I'm covered.
Correct. And that's why it's not, GRC is not really black and white. There's always that gray area. And as an organization, you need to say, all right, I've got HIPAA, I've got SOX, I've got GLBA, I've got all these things. Here's the recommendations. If somebody says no, we got to be able to say, how do we cover ourselves? Because that means then we can't fully implement something. But if something happens, we're not at fault. And that is also basically extending your own GRC internally to include operational and organizational changes, agreements, contracts, those kind of things that can be brought into GRC to make sure you're maintaining a level of integrity, engaging with customers so you know where liability and indemnification and so forth around that.
Yeah.
Yep.
So this is all incredibly complex and time-consuming and resource-intensive. How do you manage compliance more efficiently?
So there's two ways I can tell people to do it. Is that from a tactical perspective, obviously it's to do a little bit of legwork beforehand, right? And understanding and saying, hey, okay, we're going to pick a framework. In this case, whether it's CMMC or whether we'll just use CIS controls version 8. Okay, so we have two sides of the business. We have our tactical and we have our strategic, which is whether it's virtual CISO or virtual CIO. That's the strategic element, and then the tactical is our day-to-day operations of maintaining systems up or down scenario. What we want to do is the first thing is to align all the tactical elements that we do automatically for that customer and cross-work that to the controls. You very quickly see exactly that you may be able to answer in CIS controls that you've answered 15 out of the controls already, out of the 60, 70 plus questions that it has. Then you look at it and say, okay, what are we doing tactically, strategically, and align them in the tool sets that you have that you've already done. Then you can pseudo automate things already in place. That once you've got that, then the rest is requiring human intervention, which is answering questions right from the customer or from yourself, but then having the ability to have time to do that. So you can very quickly do assessments instead of looking at everything being so manual. You can align things very quickly from fully automated to pseudo to actually requiring human intervention. And that means that you can have things done on a very quick basis for customers. But then if you standardize and look across the board, you can very quickly keep an eye on compliance across multiple customers using a baseline framework, but only changing certain parameters based on the compliance that they need, whether it's HIPAA, PCI, if it's corporate law, and so forth around that. But you can do it very quickly and very easily if you spend the time in doing that. The legwork is the longest part of it. Once you've got the framework in place and the elements to do that, then you're very quickly to do things cookie cutter in and out, and generating revenue at the same time, because you can charge customers the ability to perform compliance or pre-audit assessments and so forth.
Okay.
Yep.
So is that the same thing as a gap assessment? And I guess what is a gap assessment and why would someone need them?
Yeah, exactly. So in essence, a gap assessment is basically a form of GRC. You're going in and saying, hey, I'm going in to do an assessment, right? And I'm going in to identify areas around security organization, policies and procedures, security awareness, your tool sets that you're using, how are you enforcing them, and finding out where's areas of weakness, right? In essence, that is a GRC, because on a continual basis, GRC is identifying weaknesses so you can mitigate them very quickly and bring things back into alignment. But you can base that gap analysis on many different standards that you want. Most of the entities in MSP and MSSP will do the CIS controls version 8.1 because that's the easiest one because everybody can relate to it. And it's only got like 18 sections, but multiple questions. But you can very quickly identify that from a gap analysis and turn that into a way of revenue generation by turning that into a managed service as part of your virtual CISO services to maintain that integrity and keep going. Because a lot of entities will only do it once a year. Right? They'll look at it and say, I'll do it once a year, do this gap analysis or health assessment, if you want to call it as such. Then I'll fix all the issues and then I'll wait till the next assessment. That's where risk comes into play. What we need to do is to say, how do I turn that professional services one-time engagement into reoccurring revenue and then turning that into a monthly revenue generation process? And that is making sure that organizations or your clients understand that this is not a one-stop and you're done. This is continuously. We need to maintain this wheel because as your culture changes, as your business direction changes, as administrative changes, whatever, that affects your overall posture from a security standpoint. And we need to be on top of that on a monthly, daily, weekly, quarterly, yearly basis so you can maintain a high level of integrity when it comes to your security posture.
Yeah, that makes sense. As personnel comes and goes, new products, old products being planned obsolescence and that kind of thing. I never really thought about that being a monthly or a weekly or a constant recurring issue. That's so interesting.
Yeah. Especially like you look at an industry, let's take hospitality, right? For example, and you've got clients that are working within hospitality. They could have a high turnover rate, right? Depending if they're working, the restaurant section or back office, whatever, there's a high turnover. But if there isn't a process in place to audit to make sure the termination is done correctly, you still have counts that could be still left in the system for months, for years that are wide open that you didn't know they still had access to administrative or supervisory roles within different types of platforms. So these are things that we need to take into account as part of that. And it's like when you onboard a customer, you need to understand what platforms or what applications that they use, where is their connectivity coming in from, so to get a bigger idea that you'll be able to push that into your tactical and strategic approach to GRC. So you're always evolving, always going on. And that's why QBRs or EDRs, depending on what you talk about with them, they all talk about giving the information to the customer. Now, what I tell people to do is no longer are you the wizard behind the curtain, right? As in like in Wizard of Oz, right?
Right.
When you provide a report, if you provide your clients the ability to log in to a platform to see exactly what's going on 24/7, that builds trust. That builds a level of accountability on both sides because one, it holds the MSP and MSSP accountable, right? Making sure that they're moving in the path that they're saying they're doing. They see their grades getting better, but it also pushes down accountability down to the organization that you're managing because if the grade is not moving, they can ask the question why, and you be able to present them information and say, here's the reason why. Here's 5 action items that are still waiting for your staff to complete. We can't do that right now because you need to be able to be involved. Because cybersecurity itself, whether it's GRC, whether it's tactical, whether it's antivirus, some of it has to come from the top down, not from the bottom up. So that means that we're all in the same foxhole fighting this battle against the bad actors and so forth.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, so that's a good segue into my next question, which is how you can simplify that communication between the business focused and the cyber focused executives if we're talking about top down rather than So how do you make that easier?
And it can never be easy, right? Because here's the reason why. There's a term called the stare effect, right? So depending on where you're positioned in the organization, they want to have tighter security to everybody below them except them, right? So, and that happens in many different areas. So when you get to the C-level, they don't want as tighter security as the person. So where do you think the bad actors are after? They focus on the CEO level, spear phishing and all the rest of it because they know that they're the potential weakest link. So and I hate using this because if you got healthcare people watching, I apologize. You need to flatline that, right? In the sense of using it as a stare effect. No matter where you are positioned in the company, you need to be treated the same, okay? Because what that creates is it creates a camaraderie, because it means everybody's on the same page. Everybody's affected the same. When I go in and do an actual gap analysis or an assessment based on HIPAA or whatever, I talk about sanction policy, which basically means if I violate a policy, what actually happens? What's music to my ears is that I don't want what's music to my ears is that I want to hear where there's issues, like, oh, I find this person does something, but he gets away with it. But if this person did it, they were fired, right? That's music to my ears, because that means there's an issue both culturally as well as policy and process. Because culturally, it's not about the individual, they're a nice person or not. It's based on their position, right? Cultural position in the organization, which creates their effect. But we need to kind of break that away. And the way to do that is to make sure that you have, building up the security organization, that you pick people from different departments. You just don't have it based on IT or risk management people dictating cybersecurity. You need to bring this security organization where you have a C-level sponsor. You have somebody from HR, somebody from marketing, somebody from sales. So what they do is they come together, and now they feel that they have their motion and path forward of creating a cybersecurity culture that allows GRC to be implemented successfully. Because one, they will understand and identify, oh, we do have a problem. Like, for example, Sharon, I'll use you as an example. Hey, we come to you and say, hey, Sharon, you got a lot of sensitive data in your OneDrive. And you go, I do. Yep, we found that you have 15,000 social security numbers. But what you forgot was you did a 401k audit 2 months ago, right? Because you're part of finance. So because you're part of the security organization, now we can kind of do a tabletop session and say, hey, what would happen if that data got compromised? And all of a sudden you'd be like, oh my goodness, now I get it. What do we need to do to fix this? And that helps to drive better policies, better adoption, and also allows for the security group to create a memo, right? And a memo is, now here's all the people that are signing off on it that are leaders in the company signing off on it and saying, here's the reasons why we're doing this. This is not about we have to do it. It's about we want to do it. One is we want to protect our customers. We want to protect our vendors. We want to protect our employees. And that gives a sense of like, oh my goodness, it's not just us that's affected. They're also affected as well. And that's successful in that path. But it's also how you display the data. You do need to have dashboards for executive leadership. You don't want to get down into the weeds of everything, but also have a dashboard for the tactical element of it, where people want to go down and drill down into the weeds and see the additional data sets, because that's how their mind works. But as long as the executive leadership sees areas where they can point and says, why have we got a problem here and how do we fix it? That's the key thing we need to do. Is the top down makes it really successful when it comes to cybersecurity. But it doesn't always the case. They may turn around and say, you know what, we're not going to do anything. And that goes back to what I said before. Get them to sign a piece of paper to say, we're not going to do this. Because at the end of the day, as being that managed service, you've got to protect your business as much as you have to protect theirs.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So you had mentioned the frameworks a number of times. So how do the frameworks help with all of these GRC activities? Is it mainly like I don't want to say checklist, because that seems not positive, but yeah. How does the framework help?
It's funny because it is, in actuality, it is a checklist, right? If you want to break it down to simplicity, it is a checklist, right? But what it does is for people, if you do GRC correctly, right? And what that basically means is there's a question in the control. Like it will say, do you have a password policy, right? We'll just use that as a simplified way. You're going to say yes. Now, to prove that, you would actually then go and get your updated policy for password and upload that in, because if an auditor comes in, it's going back to that simplified, what we say, which is the question, which is yes. And do we do it? Yes. And do we have a policy that states that, right? And that's what we're doing, is putting that up there and putting it in place. So the framework that you pick will help you to become standardized, right? Which means then we have to put policies and procedures in place. We have to know how to answer these questions, whether it's free form or simplified. And I'll give you the simplified version of it. It's either yes, no, or partial, right? No means we're not doing it. Yes, we're fully. Partial means we are doing it, but we have a compensating control, right? Because not everything is as simply as black and white as a yes and no. But you have to provide the evidence to do so. But also what you have to take into account that not every question can be answered by the people that are performing the actual assessment. It has to require an end user, i.e., departmental manager or a data owner for IT at the customer. You could have an IT coordinator or a technology coordinator. They need to answer at the customer level, because what happens 9 times out of 10 is we tend to answer all the questions thinking that we're going to answer the question, but that means then you're breaking the accountability level, right? Which means they need to take some ownership of it. But the checklist is very simple. That's why Excel spreadsheets were the king of GRC. They still are. I'll tell you, if people say they don't use an Excel spreadsheet, they're not. They do, right? But there's
they're not being truthful.
Yes, exactly. So, but it's the bane of existence, because what then does is it creates silos, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a problem today, because it says, are we doing a vulnerability assessment? Yes. Can I get access to your vulnerability tool? Oh, I'm going to have to ask IT to get access to that and give you that information. Now, all of a sudden, you've got a time and wait. You've got to go and doing that. There is no shared capability, which means you're waiting. And then once you get that data, then you got to merge that in. So that becomes wasteful. So what you need to do is look at a tool that allows you to merge the tactical and strategic elements into one single interface. That one, if I'm over here as the virtual CISO, I can look in very quickly. Are we doing vulnerability stuff? Are we doing data? Are we doing secure configuration standards? Yes, yes, yes. Then the rest I can focus on. And then the tactical elements will be able to see exactly where they're non-compliant around tactical stuff very quickly, because they can go into the GRC side of things of that platform and see things that they're like, I thought we were doing that. No, we're not doing it. And here's the proof. Oh my goodness, let's go and get that fixed.
Okay.
Yeah.
That totally makes sense.
Yep.
So if you're looking for a GRC tool like that, what are some of the must-haves that MSPs, MSSPs should be looking for? Are there standard features that come, or how do you choose?
And choosing can be based on, obviously in certain cases it's price, right, is number one for a lot of people, right? But if you're looking at functions and features, one is when you get into the GRC aspect, you got to look at your own resources, time, money, and people, right? How long do you want to do this assessment for? How long do you want to maintain that? Because you can't focus on one customer at a time. You got to focus on hundreds of customers at a time. So how do I merge that? How do I make it easy? But can I turn the assessment into an ongoing process? Does it allow me to hit multiple different frameworks, from CMMC to HIPAA to PCI? Does it allow me to do AI readiness assessments, right? Because now that's another thing that people don't take into account for GRC, because now AI being involved, that has access to information. And then you have a problem that's an intern asks a question, says, hey, Mr. CEO, Mr. Copilot, I use the example, what's the CEO's email on merger and acquisition? If you don't put the right parameters in place, an intern gets all this information that they're not supposed to have access to. So these things you need to take in from there. One is, can I produce a POEM, which is basically the next steps, what to do to bring that up to a level of compliance. Can I have the ability to bring in external users, i.e. employees at the client that you're providing this assessment from? Now, if we flip over to the tactical side of things, can we then do vulnerability, both internal and external? Can we take in some pen testing capability? Do we have the ability to do data classification capabilities? How do I merge that data to provide an overall risk dashboard that is very easily understood by executive leadership? Because I'll give you an example. We have this credit score scenario in cybersecurity, right? Mm-hmm. That can be very misleading, because people, need to understand, what is credit score in the first place, right? Then they want to know is high risk, low risk. But if you have a business risk register, then your risk gets lost in the stack of needles already in there, and you don't differentiate yourself. So looking at a system that gives you a grade, whether it's an F, a G, an F, or an A, that basically has a level of understanding for a lot of people. That kids are in high school, they get an A, they're doing well. They're an F, they're failing. Everything in between, we need to do a process improvement. But merging those tools together helps you to kind of define and level accountability on both sides. So there's many factors, but a lot of it comes down to functionality of those things, but also comes down to price. How much are you willing to spend? Because in certain cases, the technology stack needs to look at saying, what can I consolidate so I get a total cost of ownership? What's my ROI? And can I increase my margin right, in that sense? Or do I have the ability to add in additional margin or additional revenue based on services that I can ascertain within the platform?
Okay. And so let's talk about your company and your product in that context. So how does CYRISMA's GRC capabilities help do that?
So in our GRC capability, we went the kind of like the help the MSP and MSSP from a resource standpoint, especially around time, right, and people.
Mm-hmm.
So what we've done is basically giving them, by the end of October, we're going to have 20 plus different frameworks within our platform.
Oh,
But
cool.
each one, when they go in, has the ability to, they got the question, but they have a drop down. We automatically give them 3 simple answers to the drop down: yes, no, or partial, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then they have the ability to assign to a user, whether that's internal, whether that's to the customer, the ability to answer that control, and then giving them information on what artifacts to prove that you are, say, you're doing this. Because that's the key thing, because a lot of technical people may not know what an artifact is required for GRC. So we've actually published that in there to say, okay, if you're doing a network inventory, which is required for a lot of compliance standards, they go, okay, what do I need? 1, output your logs. 2, have a diagram of your network, which they have using Visio. All these different things that you can upload as artifacts, we help them so they're not scratching their heads of what things they need to do. Once
Okay.
that's done, then we give them the ability to personalize that report, right, to give to their clients. And those reports they can actually provide to governing bodies, whether it's PCI, whether it's Department of Health and Services for HIPAA and so forth, but personalizing it by adding your own conclusion, but also creating next steps, which the next steps is bulletizing next steps that you would like to do with the customer, whether that's already included in the current contract or the ability to turn that on as additional revenue for yourself. Now, that's on the GRC side. Now, on the tactical element, we have vulnerability, we have data sensitivity, we have secure configuration. The engineer doesn't need to know any of the GRC function. All they need to do is utilize those tools that we have built in. We automatically crosswalk and automatically apply to the GRC once you start using the technical tools. It's automatically done. So that means then it saves your virtual CISO to ask questions. The virtual CISO can log in and see vulnerability data and verify and cross, check mark off and engage with the customer as well when they're providing their report and details. So it's all inclusive within the platform itself to be able to provide that. And we're building a framework. So it's going to add more functionality as we get more feedback from our partners, which we are doing. They're loving the new reports that we brought out and all the frameworks as well, not only in the US. We brought Canada out. We're bringing out NIS for Europe. We've got Cyber Essentials for UK, Essential 8 for Australia, all the different areas. It's not just in the US. We're looking at geographic frameworks as well within the platform.
Cool.
Yep.
So we've made it 37 minutes in, and I haven't asked about AI yet. So I think that might be a new record on my part. But how do you see AI playing a role in GRC going forward specifically, but then just in general, what do you think the future of GRC looks like?
So GRC itself, AI is going to play a major component in GRC, right? In the sense of actually answering questions based on data it sees, right? And it's whatever it's able to ingest. But there's going to be certain things that it will not be able to do because it will require that human element, right? So, for example, like if you're getting into an agreement that says, like if you're doing, I'll just use an example for a governance standpoint. You're doing licensing. The AI might not have rights to all your licensing because it's not electronic; it's all paper driven, right? So it require a human. If you don't have access to that information, then you're going to manually put it in. But there is other things that you can take AI, for example, policies and procedures. That's a huge thing to make sure it's updated, monitored, maintained, and it's on the latest rev version based on your compliance. So there's a lot of things around that. Then around awareness training, right? Making sure that the latest threats are there, understanding those things. There's a lot of things that are coming down the pike from an AI standpoint when it comes to governance, but it's already seen that it's touching in every aspect of technology, even in cybersecurity. But unfortunately, AI is not something that can be self-contained. It has to have a human to drive information into AI, which is where I call it HI, which is the human intelligence, right, aspect of it.
Yeah.
Still needs to feed AI in order to get better. So the human element is not always going to go away. AI is going to reduce the amount of time and effort. And that's what we're seeing within our platform as well, with different types of variants of AI. Right now, we're using rule-based AI. If not, then this, do this. And then, as we grow stronger around that, we'll get into machine learning, but other things around that will help over the next coming years when it comes to AI.
Okay. Yeah, it's such an interesting conundrum because it has so much huge potential, but then where does it get the data? Where is it pulling from? Mm-hmm. Is the data, should it have access to that data? Where is it putting it? Yeah.
And if you go back to, let's take Microsoft Copilot, right? It's one of the fastest growing pieces of software that Microsoft's released, right? Because the amount of people see it as that digital assistant, right? Right. And it does provide support and help, right? Because you saw the fast growth of ChatGPT, and then we're in this new bubble of this whole AI, concepts. But let's put it this way. Once you allow Copilot access to certain things to help you do things, you're not realizing you're reducing the integrity of that data. And that's why Microsoft is starting to realize that certain things that you need to put in place, like, for example, SharePoint Secure Search, right, which basically limits the amount of information that Copilot can gain access to. Because if not, then it automatically gets access to everything potentially, and it allows anybody to have access to that data, right, which then becomes an issue, especially if it's sensitive data internally, payroll information, merger and acquisitions, HR lawsuits, all this kind of stuff. It becomes available to everybody. But you want to make sure you maintain that level, because there is that concern, because now that data you may have in one cloud is now available in another cloud, because all of a sudden you could be somewhere else and you're doing this. So even now, with the potential of Copilot coming down onto the desktop, which means then your personal data can be, all these things that are happening over the next coming years with AI, data is, I'll go back to one of the things that somebody said to me a long time ago. You can't institute zero trust unless you know where your data is, right? Yeah. And that's a true fact, because if you don't know where your data is, zero trust becomes basically obsolete in a way, because you can't put security concentric rings, and AI, in essence, can potentially break that already if you're not managing it correctly and allowing things, whether that's Gemini from Google, whether you got AWS, you got Copilot, and you got all these other AIs that are popping up. And even ChatGPT, when you build a widget to go and do something, you can build different things and models with just ChatGPT, just in your own home, putting a widget on your machine to do things, right? So, yeah. And even building code, right? Or the next variant of viruses or malware are now getting generated by potential AI, and that's a big risk. No matter what side of the fence you sit on, whether GRC or whether you're tactical or strategic, that's a big concern for a lot of people.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we are getting close to the top of the hour here, folks. If you have any more questions you want to send, so we can have Liam weigh in on them, go ahead and put those in the Q&A or the chat. We've had some great ones already so far, so thank you for that. I'm going to give you just another couple seconds. If you have any to submit, go ahead and put them in there now, folks. Last chance. All right. Well, Liam, thank you so very much. And thank you to the audience for joining me today. Folks, if you click on the handout circle there, you will find a handout that has some links to more information about GRC and CYRISMA and everything that Liam and I have talked about today. So go ahead and download that. Once again, the session has been recorded, so check back in about 24 hours and that will be there for you. And yeah, thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate your time. Thank you, Liam, and thank you, CYRISMA, for sponsoring. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. I'm Sharon Florentine, signing off.
Bye-bye.